All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is The Crow's Nest. This is our talk show where we're going to be talking about all sorts of things related to our games, related to game development, and it'll be a bit of a regular content update as well because we'll be talking about the work that we've been doing lately with our own stuff. So joining me, of course, the co-host with the co-most is going to be Raffle, aka Veeq7,
Hello.
and he's been here for a long time working within the No Frauds Club. In fact, before I even knew we were going to call our company the No Frauds Club, he was behind the scenes working with stuff, years and years ago. So it's lovely to have you here. He'll be joining me for all of these episodes. And for this inaugural one, I guess I can briefly talk about what the show is all about, the premise of the show. So like I said earlier, it's going to be this sort of regular discussion about game design and some thoughts that we've had lately, especially if we've been playing games, which we often try to do, and I say try very deliberately. And obviously, we'll also talk about updates to our games, to Antikythera, the engine that we're working on. And, maybe the show comes out once per week or once every other week, depending on how busy we are and depending on how much we have to say. So, with that being said, obviously, I have a couple of things that are on the list of topics here, Veek, but is there anything in particular that jumps out at you as something that has been bugging you, or maybe something not even on the list, that like a game you played recently that you wanted to talk about? Anything come to mind as far as introing us into the topic list?
So yeah, recently I've been playing some RTS games. We've obviously been working on some projects. We've been working on Smite Brood War. We're
Yep.
working on Antikythera, and I've played Age of Empires 4 recently, which I can probably mention here and there. There
Sure.
there are things that we've noticed between the games that are either things that we criticize or things that we actually have observed before to be great additions to the genre. And we've actually, when we were working on Antikythera, there were even a few things that we have implemented that they also have implemented in like Age of Empires 4 or whatnot. So
Yeah,
yeah.
one of them was something related to selecting a unit that wasn't yet built or something. I know this is something that happened in way back in Armies of Exego, which people may know if they're diehard fans of the RTS genre. It's a bit of an indie title, I guess, from way back, like Warcraft 3 era. But that's something that we definitely want to implement. Am I correct in remembering that was something
Yes,
in Age of Empires 4?
that's something that they allow you to do. They allow you when you order a building to be made, you get like a placeholder of it, like a transparent version of the building that you can add
Yeah.
to control groups and select. They haven't really progressed from Exigo though. They still don't allow you to queue orders in the building, which is an innovation that we plan to make in Antikythera.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, it's one of those things where it feels like a natural extension of that. I mean, for one, nobody did the Exego move that I was aware of until Age of Empires 4. I'm sure there's like an RTS game in between that has done it, but I'm just not aware of it. But when I played Exego, it was really striking how automatic it was to just grab those buildings once you knew about the mechanic. Just grab it and add it to a control group. Sure, like it felt very natural as an extension of the command structure or whatever. So I think that going a step further, like you're talking about queuing orders, being able to maybe set rally points, obviously,
For
if
sure.
the structure can upgrade or build a unit or something, be able to do that. So I don't know why. I wonder why. Anyway, Age of Empires 4 doesn't contain this work, but it's nice that they at least have caught up to Execo in that sense.
Yeah.
From
And
2004
actually,
or
we've been even discussing as a similar thought that when you train a unit, we have already thought about that maybe there is something where you should be able to select training units in buildings. We haven't exactly figured out the details yet, but that was something that we also thought about. I really can't wait to see how we solve that one.
Yeah, what is it like? The tough part for me is figuring out whether or not you would use the just the unit that is actively being built, or whether you'd also be able to select everything that's queued. And if you can select everything that's queued, then you have to think about like, okay, can you queue an arbitrary number of units? Because like maybe then there's some utility to actually queuing a bunch of stuff. But it is interesting as far as like figuring that stuff out goes, and allowing you to make decisions projecting into the future is interesting. I think that the reason why I even immediately think about like, can you only queue the unit that already is being constructed, is because I'm still thinking of the Brood War paradigm, which, if people don't know, internally, when a unit is being trained actively, like you see the progress bar filling up, that unit actually does exist. It's just hidden, and that's how it like takes up supply, for example, and contributes towards the unit limit internally. And so, because I know that little quirk of the engine of Brood War, I also interpret it almost as if this is something that might be a design decision going forward, which is funny because something we've talked about way back is like the modders mindset versus the actual developers mindset. And it's like, here's the stuff that I can edit versus here's the like the decisions that you have to make about the game and about the architecture of the engine and stuff, and how like you have to take a step back. So that's just an interesting observation. But yeah, I think just having control, like more control in the scheme of things, is definitely ideal because you don't want to. I mean, there's always a balance, and I don't really know where to draw the line explicitly of like this is too much control. But I do think that being able to manipulate the future a little bit with that stuff is pretty useful. So was that like the primary thing about Age of Empires 4 that like struck you as an improvement over what people have done in the genre to begin earlier on?
Yeah, I mean that was one of the things that I noticed, but that obviously was tried by Exego. But we also have the thing where you can like scroll past the border, which we added in Antikythera. That wasn't ever. I never observed that in any other game. You always were locked at the border, and here you aren't.
Right.
I noticed actually something interesting. I don't know what your thoughts are. I don't think I ever mentioned it to you, but there's actually a system of sub-selection. You know how in like StarCraft 2 you can click tab to change like the command card?
Yes.
So they've done something similar, but basically when you select the subtype of selection, so let's say you have, as an example of Brood War, let's say you have Firebats and Marines selected. If you select you use tab to select the Marines, then you can actually comment only to them. So you can have. They did something interesting with this, although that's probably too much automation, where you can actually have like a subselect of types where only commands go to that subselect, but you don't like lose your selection, which is like I don't know if that's enough description for you to understand and for the viewers.
Yeah. So it sounds like with the way that StarCraft 2 or Warcraft 3 did it, as more popular games anyway, is that you would hit tab to change what active abilities you could cast on the command card.
The command card, right?
But you would still be ordering like movement orders and attack orders to the whole selection. And that's the difference here, it sounds like, is that basically you can switch to, say, something like a Marine and then issue Stim Pack, but also if you issue a move order after that, it'll only issue to the Marines.
Yeah, that's something.
That's interesting. I mean, it's not a million miles away from, say, if you have something bound to Control Group 1, you recall the control group and you have two different unit types, and then you like control left click on the first unit type. If you do this in Brood War, you'll actually change your selection to just that unit type, even if you're doing it in the control panel in the bottom, where all the wireframes are. So that still works just by that logic. If you wanted to do that, it's like really it's not saving you too many clicks, but I do want, I wonder how it would be possible to make sure that it's not too much automation. But it is interesting. It is an interesting idea.
I think the general observation with all those things that we just said is that usually when we design, and generally when you want to design things in a competitive game, we usually want to evaluate how much consistency it has and how much automation it has. Since usually the more consistent thing is like easier to learn for the player and all that, but like automation might, if you have too much automation, you can remove too many important decisions from the player.
Yeah.
At which point you're basically playing a cutscene, not a game. So pretty important.
Yeah. Something fundamental to the experience is, removed when, say your ability to train units is automated or something to that effect, where like that's a decision that you have to make anyway, where it's like, when do I want to spend my money and stuff like that? And where do I want these units in the first place? If they're always popping out of like one production structure on this side of the map, maybe that's actually not good. So it's almost like a noob trap, right? It's like this like training wheel in theory that's actually going to teach you really bad habits. So yeah, in addition to consistency and like balancing the automation with the consistency that you were saying, I think another way to put it is like we want to make sure that the players have tools at their disposal to make interesting decisions. We want the outcome of that to be as much tethered to the players' decisions as possible, so that they can take ownership over the results. So if like you obviously if the binary thing is if you win or you lose, if it was due to something that you like didn't even notice because it was automated, maybe that's not nearly as easy to track down, and it's difficult to improve under that category. It's difficult to like break a habit that was built based on that automation. Whereas, I mean, it's the same sort of a similar argument, at least in that if like you lost due to RNG, suddenly that's like literally something you couldn't control because it was just a dice roll. Like you could maybe affect it by like trying more times than you did to see if you can get the RNG hit again or something. Like something that happens in competitive Warcraft 3 is you try to give attack speed to the Blade Master so that you can attack more often, so that you have more rolls to crit or whatever. It's silly, right? And
I think there's that famous memory of yours where Grubby's yelling for the orc hero to crit.
Yeah, it's like he's in a competitive ladder match or whatever, and you know, all this top ladder player can do is yell, "Come on, crit!" Like he's like cheering on his Pokemon or something. I don't know. It doesn't feel like it has any place.
He could have done this, right? The game is not particularly APM heavy, so he can just yell for crits.
Yeah. I mean, he keeps like tasking him on it or whatever. There's all these like micro things you can do in Warcraft 3 because of the fact that like the units are not really smart with the way that they pathfind and stuff. So there are things you can do, but it is on average it trends down as far as the APM counts go, which isn't. I was thinking about this earlier. I don't know if it's like necessarily a bad thing if you don't get up to 300 APM or what have you. But I do think that it's a sign of engagement, generally speaking, because obviously there's the conversation with like APM, which is actions per minute, versus EPM, which is like effective actions per minute or something. And it's like, okay, you can like spam, click, or select a bunch of stuff and boost your APM and inflate it, but that's not really doing anything. It's not affecting change on the map. So I don't know that it's necessarily a smoking gun to say like, oh, this game's really good or bad, depending on how high APM you can get, or even how high EPM you can get. But I do think that something I've noticed in content that engages me versus content that doesn't, video games that engage me versus video games that don't, it's like really a sure sign is whether or not I am actually playing at a relatively high APM. Like using all the tools at my disposal, because this could extend to like FPS games or whatever, where you don't really think of like APM in the same way, but if I'm like constantly using my mind to think about like I have this weapon and it has this much ammo left and I have this like, I don't know, grenade in Counter-Strike.
It's just like efficiency of time. It was basically like if you ever play chess, you know that some moves are way better in tempo because they just accomplish more things than other moves where they just like they only do one idea where some other moves do like 3 at a time, right? So it's a resource basically.
Yeah. I do like to conceptualize APM itself, or I guess focus of the player as a resource when I'm designing a tool for them to use, say a unit in an RTS context, right? It's like if this unit is say a cheap unit, then maybe it shouldn't. Maybe APM shouldn't be a crazy difference maker as far as like, you know, besides like general things like kiting or positioning before a fight or something, which you can boil those down to APM to some degree. It's like, do you have the wherewithal to position your unit correctly and micro your unit in the middle of a fight? But aside from stuff like that, it's like there's clearly some units that benefit more from like tender love and care where you're managing it manually. That's like obviously any spellcaster because they have an active ability instead of an automatic weapon, stuff like that, right? And so I like to think of it as a resource in the same way that you'd think of, you know, the time cost or the resource costs of the unit that you harvest the resources out of the ground or whatever to train this unit. It's like I think of it very similarly because you get this opportunity to engage the player, but only like really what's differentiating good versus bad play with this particular tool is how effectively you're using it, and the way that you can figure out how effective somebody is at least in part how much time they have set aside to micro it in the middle of a fight. And that's why I think RTSs, especially now, are super, like, I would say niche, but in a way that I almost feel like they're what you've found, and this is really a potential rabbit hole to go down, but keeping it as far as to the RTS genre is concerned, it's like the world is niche now. It's like there's so many things. We're in the information age. There's so much like content that you can stick your feet into or whatever, and be like, oh, what's going on here? Like, you don't have time to explore everything, and so because there's like the pop culture games of the day, which are like maybe you could say MOBAs and maybe to a lesser extent FPS games or something, and a lot of them are very like, I won't say super simplified, but fundamentally a MOBA is simpler than an RTS because it's like half of the game. And then that means that they can go deeper on like items or experience or abilities or whatever. But as far as the RTS genre is concerned, it's like it's a lot of, if you just transported somebody back in time that were like, say they've played a little bit of an RTS before, but they mostly play like Dota 2 or League of Legends or something, and then you sat them in front of a game like Brood War as it was coming out, they would probably think it's like this is like 2 or 3 games in one game in terms of how much stuff you have to do, right? Especially when you're considering like the APM that you have to put in. And that's probably why you can't get to the same levels of APM or effective APM in other titles, is that RTS games specifically are like, they are about multitasking fundamentally, I think. At least if they are stressing the real-time aspect of their genre's name, they are about really testing your ability to balance everything out, to multitask, and I think that's what makes it really good. It's like you get into some sort of flow state when you're on your game, and you're able to really like know ahead of time. You're almost projecting like a good chess player would. You're projecting into the future of like, I'm going to take this base in a minute, so I'm going to move my worker there to expand, or I'm going to position my units in such a way because I scouted him earlier, so I know like he's not ready for this attack or whatever. There's all sorts of different things you can do there, and that niche of it basically being multiple games in one in terms of how many things you have to do. I don't know if it could work in another context. I feel like probably it could, but at least in this case, it's like, People always think about like, how do I make this next innovative game? But I think like RTSs are already like, if they came out today, they would be very innovative, and people just kind of give them a pass right now because it's not something that they're already used to it. Basically, it's interesting to think about like how many games worth of a game are already in Brood War, for example.
I think that fundamentally, if you focus on having a strong game, strong RTS game at a core, you actually achieve a really strong gameplay loop, and you don't have to fill in the game with like filler content where it's basically a bunch of complexity that nobody asks for. And if you see like any MOBA like League of Legends or whatever, you see a lot of like complexity in items and champion design, but the actual core of the game is pretty simple. It's actually pretty, like, the required APM to play the game is not even like comparable to RTS games. That I think the RTS games have a really strong core, and that's what makes them unique.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, if they're doing it right, which is a loaded term, obviously. And there's a lot of people who like RTS games that you and I would say maybe aren't doing it right. And maybe we can actually turn the tables a bit. So was there like, I mean, this list might be a lot longer than the things that you liked about Age of Empires 4, but were there things that made you think, oh, this could have been done better, or this shouldn't even have been done? Anything like spring to mind?
I'd say that the campaigns of Age of Empires 4, they don't utilize the core basically at all. There are barely any macro missions. Or, I mean, there are some, but they are full of gimmicks, and they don't give you the full tech tree. So, they are pretty okay for like an intro player to get familiarized with the tech tree, but when you're actually any good at RTS games, it's actually not challenging you, even on the hardest difficulty.
That's interesting that you brought up specifically that the tech tree is like restricted or whatever in the early stages of the game, and then also that like the core of the game, like the actual gameplay that you can have in the game, isn't even actualized in the campaign. There's a lot of similarities with Five Nations, and briefly I will talk about it. It's a indie space RTS. If people haven't know, I don't mind saying check it out, but maybe I should mind saying check it out. And if you know, you know. But Five Nations is a game that I started by testing. First of all, it wasn't even working on my computer for like over a year, maybe close to 2 years after I bought it. They seem to have rectified that now, although it's not all sunshine and flowers. But the way that I was testing to see if it was working was playing skirmish games. And eventually I just started playing skirmish games a little bit, like, maybe once a day or something. I'd boot up the game and fire up just playing as the one race that was going to be the intro race, so I didn't spoil too much of the experience for myself when I played the campaigns. But what this led me to realize is that, like, functionally in skirmish, Five Nations is an RTS, and it has RTS gameplay. It has a lot of things I don't personally agree with. It's a design decision. I don't like supply. I don't like the second supply that they have, and I don't like the way that their economic model works, and I also don't like upgrades or researches or anything like that. I think that it ruins a lot of consistency, and that's a separate thing anyway. But just to illustrate that I don't have, like, I'm not like mapping what I like one-to-one onto Five Nations, I still was able to come away with it feeling like, oh, at least there's a skirmish experience, right? There's AI, they build a base, they expand, they tech up, and they attack. And that's all the things that you really want to do. And most of the time in a campaign, you don't really get the same experience, right? Because there's definitely not an even playing field. But even if you throw that out of the window and say, like, okay, well, you're, like, attacking a fortress, so of course, like, this castle is not going to have an even playing field with your attacking forces because it's, like, more rooted in, but you have to, like, defeat it anyway. Whatever the case may be, in, like, the campaign story framing that, like, explains why there would be some sort of lack of even playing field, you still don't usually get the same core gameplay, which is what you were talking about. It's like, I don't have all the tech tree options. I don't have the, I don't have the experience where I can just, like, walk in and expect my opponents are playing the same game as me fundamentally. Maybe they have infinite money, or maybe they have everything pre-placed for them, and as a result, it's a very different experience. I would say always worse, but even if your, like, tastes are just different, you have to acknowledge at least that it's different as an experience. And so the tech tree thing got me because it's like, it's almost like if everybody started off their time with a game, instead of playing the single player content, played skirmish mode, and then they played the single player content, they would be I think they'd be shocked how different it really was. And I mean, at least if you like RTS games, they'd probably be shocked at how much worse the experience was of playing an RTS within the campaigns, because a lot of the time campaign missions don't seem to let you do it, right? There's the gimmicks you were talking about, or there's, like, the tech tree restrictions and stuff. So
I've actually played some skirmish in Age of Empires 4, and even though there are, like in the example of Five Nations, there are some things that I don't personally like, and I think even objectively would be better without. The game's actually, on competitive ladder, it seems pretty cool. Like, you have a lot more races than, let's say, StarCraft, and you do have things like rock, paper, scissors, or supply. They haven't really bothered me that much when playing the game, even though we have envisioned systems that work better, and we've already tried them. But generally, there were some depth to the strategy, so I was sort of positively surprised, even though it's not exactly what I would have imagined. It was actually, it was actually enjoyable, even though those issues actually, like, even though there's, like, rock, paper, scissors, there actually seems to be a depth to the strategy you can choose, compared to, like, StarCraft 2, where the game's, like, pretty much optimized, and you mostly have, like, very limited choices. Here you actually seem to be able to not only choose from a much bigger pool of civilizations, you can also actually, like, your strategies usually vary way more than in StarCraft, and I think that's great, and that's something that we aim with both our Cosmonarchy Brood War mod and with our games that we are in production. And I think probably automation has, like, it has a big role here, since games with automation usually, like, let's say it that way. When something is optimized, when choice is taken away from you, like in StarCraft 2, where something is pretty much a foregone conclusion, some decisions are decided before the game starts. Like, the fact that you start with expanding in StarCraft 2 is pretty much the meta. You barely ever do something else unless you, like, all in. But at that point, some people actually want to automate it. Like in example of Immortal, I believe they automized the training of workers, since in, like, StarCraft 2 is, like, a foregone conclusion that you will be training workers until, like, at least like 66 for I think some builds, and then mostly like 80 for other builds. So yeah.
Yeah, the example of training workers is wild to me because having played the Cosmonarchy Brood War mod that we've been working on a lot, and just imagining the better thing, that design exercise, it's to me it's really wild to think that like the solution to like presumably when you automate something away, the choice like you said earlier, the choice is taken from the player as far as what to do there. But sometimes you don't really care if the player makes a choice. Like sometimes that's not even related to the skills you're trying to test. For example, telling a worker to go back to harvesting after they return the resource is not really something we care about in an RTS game because you're harvesting resources all the time. So why would you need to like manually do that? Sure, automate that away. It's a silly example, but it illustrates the point. It's like, here's how we're breaking down what is good to automate away as far as like something that gives enough space for the player to spend their actions and their focus on more interesting decisions. I guess another example, and it's a weird thing to say automation for, but in default Brood War, Dragoons have a really rough time making it up ramps, and the same is true for Goliaths, and also to a lesser extent Ultralisks. And the solution to this is to make it so that they move at a consistent pace, so that they're not constantly like looking to make recalculate their path while they're sort of clumped up together. And also, I guess another solution would be to make it so that the ramps have more room on them that's pathable, which is something Blizzard definitely could have done, but they didn't. And so, anyway, the end result is if you do these couple of steps, it feels more smooth. It feels more automatic, right? The units are going to their destination. It seems so simple and so trite to say, but ultimately it's like, yeah, you actually do want your units to follow your orders. You want that process to be, it's weird to even say automatic because you manually gave them an order, but you don't want to then manually correct their paths too. Like you want the pathfinding to work properly in that sense. And making the changes that I was just laying out is what we did in Cosmonarchy Brood War to make the units in general, like we avoided having that issue with pathing for all units in general. As if we added a new unit, we made sure it didn't have that problem, and if we were editing an existing unit to correct it, it just instantly felt more smooth. And what that turns into basically is the idea that you can actually just order your units, and you can actually just, like with a worker resource example, it's like, yeah, I don't have to worry about manually doing it again. But if you're automating a decision, basically what you're saying as a designer is this decision isn't important, or it can be critical for like the actual outcome of a game, but we don't really want to test for it. We don't want to say you should really be doing this all the time, so we're going to automate it away. But then the problem becomes like, if you're taking that approach to something as critical as training a unit in a game, and in this case, it's like, as far as I know it with Immortal, it's just the workers and it's not other units. But the idea of like making it so that your units automatically pop out screams to me like a cover-up Band-Aid, where the issue that they're observing, presumably, I'm speaking for them hypothetically here, is that training workers is not interesting. And instead of making worker training interesting, or vetting that claim to begin with, because I think in most games it is actually interesting, but they're saying, okay, that's not interesting, let's just automate it away, instead of making it interesting, right? Instead of fixing the design issue, they bandage it up. And I don't know to what extent that's pervasive across the rest of the RTS space. As far as automation goes, I haven't really looked at it super heavily. I think it's a more recent trend in general because the older games tended to be less friendly to noobs, less friendly to players who weren't super skilled or weren't super high APM or whatever. And so that automation angle didn't really come into play too often, I don't think. But I'm also missing a bit of the historical context there because I'm not old enough to remember like the days before Brood War, basically. But as far as that is concerned, it's like I couldn't imagine automating away something as critical as training a unit, especially a worker, which is super important for harvesting and for construction.
There's actually a lot of depth to the decision when you want to build workers, when you want to cut them, and when the game becomes so solid like StarCraft 2, there's actually not much of a decision at all, where you just always train them until like a cap. And you wouldn't even have that cap if they have recognized that supply is like a limit.
Yeah.
Talking about supply is actually pretty interesting that Age of Empires 4 still has the supply limit of 200, and I think most games do, right? Like
yeah. StarCraft 2 does.
Haven't
Warcraft 3
progressed.
doesn't. Hey, Warcraft 3 has half or something.
Yeah.
Wonder why that is. Couldn't be due to their
Isn't
engine
Immortal
being
also cutting it in half or something?
I think the thing about Immortal's supply, I believe they're at 200, but in team games, it gets
They
cut,
split
divided.
it,
It's
yeah.
divided by the number of
Yeah, the game
players.
is not
which
performant. What did they use? Chromium?
Nah, that's Five Nations.
That's
no,
Five
they.
Nations, yeah.
I'm pretty sure they're joining. They're like the first on the scene as far as Unreal Engine RTS game goes.
Oh, right, I remember.
Stormgate came out with their news that they were also doing it. Although that's, I guess, just for graphics. And in Stormgate's case, they have their own, presumably bespoke work that they're doing for computation, and it like integrates on top of Unreal Engine.
Yeah, real-time strategy mechanics like pathfinding and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that you would want to take ownership over those on a programmatic level because those are really important, and most of the time they suck, or at least they have a lot of really obvious edge cases. However, the idea of integrating something into Unreal Engine is just... I don't know the specifics, so I will go on. I'll say just I could be wrong here, but that sounds like a nightmare in terms of like making sure everything works and also that everything is performant. Like that doesn't seem right.
It's like from the back end, it's object-oriented engine, and it's also very heavily based on inheritance, which even object-oriented people don't defend nowadays. It's really a disaster, and I don't know. I personally believe that taking ownership of all code you're using in your game is ideal. It's not possible because you have to work with the system you're developing for, like Windows or Linux or macOS, if that's even like on your goalpost. But yeah, you can't really work with like you don't have complete ownership of your GPU either. So there are some limitations, but I personally believe that's true, especially when you have a big team like First Giant Studios do. I think that's way better. Although I understand that Unreal Engine is pretty much like leading technology in graphics, and that's a big selling point for them. So maybe that's why they did it, but I still feel like taking ownership is something that you need to do to really have a great experience.
Yeah, to produce a great product, right? And the other thing is that like they've just bought lock, stock, and barrel the idea that it should be 3D instead of 2D, which obviously you and I don't usually agree with. I guess Age of Empires 4 is also 3D, isn't it? So it's like it's not the first 3D Age of Empires game, but for people who played Age of Empires 3, they probably wish to remove that from their memory. So maybe it is the first one. Just to retcon Age of Empires 3 out of the game, please.
Age of Empires 3, I think the biggest problem is how they tried to innovate with complexity. They did like decks. System that's... I mean, it kind of developed an interesting meta from what I was recently looking at, but it's like a very complicated system that doesn't really add... I mean, it adds some depth to the game, but it's not much, and I'd rather not have it. Age of Empires 4 thankfully didn't do anything quirky like that.
Yeah, it's interesting because now that it's a bigger design team behind it, I have a feeling that like that gets into different topics of like risk or whatever. Your point about Unreal Engine and the size of the Stormgate team actually paradoxically made me think of like the bigger the team is, especially the more rooted in like the current game development industry the team members are. I think the more... It's funny because you'd think, oh, big team means lots of resources and you can do all sorts of stuff with that, so why don't you make your own engine or whatever? But I think it's the other way around, actually. If you have a bigger team, especially if they aren't like super old, tenured people, you probably are biased towards Unreal or Unity or one of these like bigger name
you're probably
engines.
Right
because they have all of the experience in that, right? That's where they cut their teeth. They're not gonna sit here and like try to remember or like try to do a new thing, you know? Like it's weird. It's like counterintuitive initially, but when you shade that detail in, I feel like it clicks.
Yeah, the more people in corporation you have, the less actual control. Like you can't really have absolute ownership over anything in a corporation. I think there's a great video from Casey Muratori that is actually describing the problem of how like the charts of hierarchy and corporations actually result in like basically the output of what they are doing is grouped the same way that they are grouped as teams. So that's a thing to think about. It's like you won't ever really have absolute ownership over anything in such a big team, because you just can't control everything, or you would. I mean, maybe if companies have gave them enough time, then maybe, but nowadays everything seems to be like a really short deadline, and there's a lot of crunch and all. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean the landscape as far as like building up a team and trying to do it in the AAA sense. I mean, to an extent, I think even Immortals developers. I always screw up their company name. I think it's Sunspear, but it might be Sunspire. Whatever their development team name is, the I think it must be Sunspear. It's almost certainly that.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, so their game. I can't remember where I got Sunspire from, but their team has investors now and stuff. Like they've secured investment, and we've talked about like getting investment to some degree or whatever. And I mean, for one, our method is like super abstract to most people. Like building your own engine. What are you doing? Stuff like that. But I don't know how good how easy it would be to do a pitch. But I also, like you and I have both expressed concern where it's like we obviously need money to keep the lights on while we do our work. But if we take on investors, that's a different vibe. It's like the investors expect a return on their investment. They expect certain things. Maybe they want control over the project to some degree of like now you're tied down and you can't take ownership in that sense. So I mean, as much as like I may disagree with the output or find the quality of the work that they do in question or whatever, depending on whenever the games come out, I don't envy the position that those guys are in, because having to, especially for the Immortal side, like the developers of that game come from StarCraft 2 like mapping backgrounds, basically, where they like made a new game state in that and they tried to do some work there. And it's like, okay, if you guys are anything like us, we basically were trying to build something better than what we had, and that snowballed into us basically having ideas for building our own games. There's a lot of common ground theoretically there. And so when you shade that detail in that context, it's like really interesting to think about that, but also really terrifying to think about like no longer being able to take ownership over things. It's like it's a weird example, but when I was still making like content within the original setting of StarCraft before I started to like rewrite everything, somebody asked me like, would you like if you like you realize that like there's a potential chance where you can't like take any of the characters from this stuff and like adapt them to a new setting because technically Blizzard owns this. And I was thinking like, I definitely wouldn't want there to be like a potential legal issue like hanging over my project's head because I decided to take like a character and even like a character name potentially. I don't think they would, and I don't even know if the legal grounds are there, but it's like, do you even want to risk that sort of thing? And that, even just thinking about that was like enough to make me think, yeah, okay, I definitely need to just like start writing my own stuff instead of worrying about making something within this environment or whatever. So it's just an interesting thing to think about. It's like how do you balance that where you need money, you take on investment, but now they have some control over the project. Now they expect something. Even the expectation of money is still some element of control, because now if you make a decision that like reduces the amount of money you get initially, but maybe is a better long-term decision, or maybe a better decision for the quality of the project, forgetting about the profit, because they're not always intertwined, then suddenly you're in violation of the investor agreement. Like suddenly they can, I don't know if it's legal action, depends on how big the contract is or whatever, but and depends on the details, but they can certainly maybe pull their rest of the investment that you were counting on. Like they can do all sorts of stuff. So that's really scary to think about. And again, going back to taking ownership fully of the project that you're working on, it's like you definitely want to be able to do that, and it just encompasses all of the different aspects. It's like, yeah, let's try to do our best without with just like fending for ourselves as far as money goes, or hopefully finding like obviously we tried with Indie Fund, finding some stuff there where it's like here's like these people who don't want to have control over the project, and they just want they want to give you money and they want to get some money back after. And it's like, okay, well, if we do our job right, then not only will we prove that you don't need microtransactions in a game to make money, but we'll also have a really good game. So like maybe we can find something like that, and that'll be good. But it's just wild to think about like here's a potential outcome. Like, really, it sounds silly, but even though I've never really done much in StarCraft 2, it's like I could have been in the same position that those guys with Immortal are, and that's scary to think about because that I do not envy their position at all.
Yeah, so I think the absolute ownership comes with absolute responsibility, and for absolute responsibility, you basically not need absolute authority. And if people from outside that are only concerned about like basically earning as much money as possible, they will change your they will lower your authority. That's the first thing, and the second thing is that there might actually be a conflict of interests where they will want something more short term where you would want something more long term.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And so like there's a conflict right within your own decision making because at the end of the day you're who decides stuff, but if these are the inputs, it's going to really change stuff. It's like it extends beyond like you when you said absolute authority, it reminded me of like basically I like to as the game director or creative lead or whatever, like in the same way that I would think of you as this way with regards to Antikythera, the engine. I kind of think of myself as the benevolent dictator of the game. You know what I mean? It's like, listen, I know what I'm doing. I'm somewhat like I'll use the term visionary, even though I know that sounds cringe to say about yourself. But it's like I know I have these ideas. I've really thought this through. We're gonna explore them and see if I'm right, or they've already been explored and I'm already convinced they're right, or whatever. Let's do them. And like if somebody comments on a YouTube video or joins the Discord server and says like, "Oh, actually, I think it would be better if you did this," I will actually have a reason why I disagree, or maybe it's a good decision or good suggestion or something. But like I'll engage with it, but I'll fundamentally like the decision is mine. I'm not going to ask for like recently the Five Nations author was asking if it would be worth it, which is like a weird, I mean, English isn't his first language, so I'll give him a pass, but it's like a weird thing to say is like, what do you mean worth it for what? What's the context? But would it be worthwhile to port Five Nations to Unity and change, and if so, would it be good to change it to 3D? And it's like these are really big decisions about your game, and you're just asking people on your own Discord server who maybe aren't programmers, maybe aren't artists, maybe haven't worked with these tools, like probably not because they're probably just gamers, right? And so they probably don't know much, right? And just the idea that you would potentially outsource that decision making to somebody else is crazy. And you and I have spoken about Frostgiant Studios in the same way. It's like the work that they've been doing on Reddit is crazy. It's like a complete polar opposite of what I would ever want to do, where I publicate all of my game design documentation as much as I've written, and it's like, here's my design documentation. You can read it and figure out what you think about it, and like give me ideas or feedback or what have you, and maybe I integrate some of that, and maybe I don't. Depends on what the feedback is and how well it's articulated. But like this is at least I'm documenting it. I'm showing it off to you. I'm saying like here's some ideas. Frostgiant Studios aren't really doing the publication part, but they are like it's like they're getting ideas on something that nobody really knows what the game is. And for the longest time, they didn't even announce their title or whatever, and they were still doing these AMAs and these like reading they purported to read every comment on the subreddit.
They have a lead designer behind the scenes. They just have asked people what to do, and they don't know. Like they don't like. It seems like they evaluate everything basically, and like in the void, right? I don't know if that's correct in English, but basically they don't
evaluate it all evenly with no context.
Yeah, they don't use context. They don't use like depth analysis. Like when I can criticize you for like an ability or something, your design, I usually don't know as much as you do. So very often I think something's like probably not the greatest decision or whatever, but you actually know more about the game. And very often you can actually pinpoint me why that decision is actually good, because you have a lot of knowledge that may be not even about the current state of the game, but also about like the planned state of the game and where you're going for, which I just don't have. And I'm a part of the team, so a random person that played the game for like whatever many hours and joined the server will not even have my level of understanding, and your in particular.
Well, it's also a sign that maybe the concept ought to be communicated better. But I mean, if you're in the middle of like a really heavy overhaul or something like we are right now with the Brood War mod, it's you're bound to get into situations like that. But you're right in that it's like it's a really good point to think of it like they don't have the context. They're evaluating every comment by itself on its own island almost. And I don't know if this is true. That's the other thing, is that this could all be cynical from Frostgiant Studios. It could actually just be that they're driving up engagement, getting up upvotes on Reddit, and then really they actually know what they're going to do or whatever. Or maybe they're using it for marketing. I don't know. I don't know what the details are. But the side effect of it that I predict, and I don't know if this is happening because I haven't been keeping up on their goings on and as far as their community goes, but my proposed like prediction or whatever is that there's going to be a group of people who think like basically Stormgate is going to be many things to many people until it's out or until more details are released about it or whatever, and then people are going to say, oh, I thought it was supposed to be everything I wanted in an RTS because that I was consulted on Reddit. And then, maybe there's going to be some, at least a small subsection. Remember, Reddit is like a very vocal minority, but there's going to be some subsection of people who are going to turn into haters just because they weren't, they were presumably consulted and they put their comments out and it wasn't used by the authors, or it wasn't used completely or something, like that can certainly happen. And I think it's like the anti-marketing basically is like you just create people who are now jaded.
I think it's almost a truism that you won't ever please everyone, and it's just better to stick to your beliefs and what you think is the best for the game and from the experience that you're going for, because then it all makes connection. It's not like a spaghetti of ideas. It's actually all like it all creates some depth that was pre-designed by the designer instead of just being a bunch of random ideas that were forced to exist together.
Yeah, 100%. And that's just one of those things where it speaks to a general... I mean, again, I don't think anybody has seen Stormgate, like, design, because we've only seen some, like, a couple of units from them or whatever, and we know that there's 2 announced races with more coming later or something. But we haven't really been able to see like the gameplay systems that they've gone for. At least I haven't been able to see that because I don't keep track of it. I'm a busy guy. But the idea of like maybe at the end of the day, it's actually the greatest RTS ever. But I don't think that's going to happen. I also don't think that's a justification for the outlook or the design ethics or whatever of the group. It's like what you guys are doing with the idea of building up this understanding of Frostgiant Studios and like, here's what we believe to do, except we're going to ask you what we believe to do. It doesn't even compute for me. It's the people on Reddit are not game designers. The people on these social media sites are not game developers. They don't have the context of what you want, but what they want might not even be what they want. They might not even know what they want really. There's a lot of people who have said like, I remember, I mean, this is a strange example, but hopefully I can tie it together, is like, when I first came up with the concept for the Star Sovereign and started implementing it, people were saying, oh, that's OP. That'll be too powerful. And, like what they wanted in their heads was something that was less powerful than that, because it's too powerful. For people who don't know, it's this Protoss spaceship that literally does the thing out of the intro cutscene where it fires this beam of plasma that glasses like a whole surface and stuff. And it's pretty widespread. It's like wider area than a nuke. It might be like double the size or something. It's a very powerful unit, deals up to 2,500 damage. Sounds OP when you just say it like that. But if now you shade in context, it's a very expensive final tier air unit. It's very slow. It doesn't have the best defenses while it's channeling this ability.
While channeling, and it also the ability also doesn't actually damage early units. So there's a major
there's a lot of context there where it's like
leverage.
It's very explicitly designed in that sense where it's like, I don't believe it's overpowered. And so if I had listened to the mob of people who said, no, that's too much, that's too powerful, who knows what would have happened? Maybe I never would have implemented the ability, or maybe I would have saved it for like a hero in a gimmick section of a micro mission or something. I
think that actually makes it a very interesting example of how you can do organic design, because actually there's no unit that would deal bonus damage to Star Sovereigns, or there's also no unit that would like even deal bonus damage to air units. And with Star Sovereign example, you actually make an organic weakness with this ability, where you now actually require escorts, and that actually adds depth to the game without actually being like artificial. We have a counter that is created from the design of the unit instead of just being like artificial damage bonus to a certain type of unit or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you had this observation that stuck with me a while back where you said that basically hard counters like subvert the idea of the decision. Like they almost automate the decision away if you want to take the definition of like removing player choice or whatever. It's like they short circuit the decision making apparatus that the player has. And they basically say just do this. But if the hard counter didn't exist, but the units were still like specialized to some degree, you would get this sort of I describe it as soft counters, but it's just the idea of like this organic sort of intertwining and
Yeah, it's an interaction that came
units.
out from the design instead of just like being
mandated.
artificially added, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
actually, it's funny because I recognized that in the Age of Empires games where you have like you have this mechanic where you like cavalry counters archers and like archers counter infantry and infantry counters cavalry, but actually, if you look at how the game is played, it's very often not like the bonus damages are not what actually defines the gameplay, but the actual dynamics of their statistics are. So a unit that is very mobile is used for harassment. A unit with long range is usually used as your backline DPS. And I think that that thing is way more valuable. And I think that also teaches people more valuable lessons about what actually interacts well with what. And then if you also add some passives or abilities that work well with those dynamics, I think then you have a very deep design that is very organic and just comes out from itself instead of being like artificially designed tree of interactions that most games seem to right now have, especially RTS games.
Right. Well, I mean, it's almost like there's the observation that RTS games are really complex and have a lot of moving parts, and because of that complexity, that depth, you could say, there's attempts to ironically short circuit the depth by making it so that it's easier to understand what your composition should be, or it's like, standardization or optimization. You use that term regarding StarCraft 2. It's like if the game state becomes optimized, that's one of the reasons why StarCraft 2 was literally getting. Yeah. I mean, StarCraft 2 was getting meta changes on a monthly or every so often, like every few months basis.
They had to, because players weren't able to figure out anything new. The game was literally like, you literally didn't have enough content in the game that would be worthwhile that you could actually make up your own decisions at sometimes. Like, obviously there are some build orders that you can follow. You have some different styles where you can like play more economic or whatever, but all in all, you mostly take the same decisions most of the time, and those decisions are pretty shallow, and most often you will have an optimal decision where just one decision is way better than the other. So that is a thing that doesn't allow you to express character as a player, and also doesn't allow you to express skill. It's pretty bad because it also automizes the game to a point where it's always the same and it doesn't really matter anymore.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is when I think about the hard counter problem or the mindset of hard counters, it's like, to me, I just think about it like you could have created this organic space where there's this like big thing that happens or whatever. Like the Star Sovereign example is, I think, a great success with the design methodology of give the players powerful tools and make it so that they still have things that they can do in response. Like, you don't really need a single powerful tool to defeat a Star Sovereign, especially if it's in the middle of its glassing channel where it can't really fight back that much. But what you can do is, I think it's kind of obvious. You can build a lot of smaller, individually less significant tools and swarm it that way or something. Like if you just happen to have a lot of fighters or frigates, you can throw those at this capital ship. And I mean, by virtue of it requiring that escort, that's why it tends to require an escort, because it can be picked off in that respect. So there's like this organic decision making.
I think the beautiful thing about RTS games is that you actually have multiple tools. If you play like a match of League of Legends, you can end up in a matchup that just hand counters you, and since you just play as one character, you're basically fucked. But in RTS games, you can actually composite an army that is pretty good at many things, and it's really cool that when you technically get countered, you not only have one unit, so you can create a variety of tools that help you with the challenges that you have during a skirmish or whatever you play in an RTS game.
And that's one of the reasons. I mean, I would just say this whole topic is one of the main reasons why. And I mean, a lot of this conversation is sort of centered in some part or another, some way or another. It's been centered around ownership. It's like if you don't have ownership of the concepts or the gameplay or whatever within your project, then maybe you never get to the point where interesting interactions fall out of the complex design or even simple design, for that matter, to use Reagan Burns' term when he was on the channel for an interview. He talked about how like the story of his game design career was basically like the revelation. One of the revelations was building up this idea that if you just create a simple framework, but the simple framework is made up of the right components, it can create this cascading effect where suddenly like this thing interacts with this thing, and it just creates a lot of really interesting choices. This sandbox of tools is actually another way that people have started to describe things, as like, you know, here's the sandbox, it contains these tools, and you go up against things that have these tools, and what does that change about your interactions and stuff. And especially in an RTS, where like one of the things that I never really liked too much about the historical RTS games is that the factions always ended up feeling very similar. And Age of Empires as a franchise has had this problem.
Yeah.
I would estimate it as a problem because it's like, here's mostly the same, like if you think about an RTS environment, it's like here's mostly the same race, but you've got a couple of new units. It'd be like if instead of Terran, Zerg, and Protoss, like you have it's instead of Terran, Zerg, and Protoss, you have like Terran, and Terran, but each Terran has a different, like, I don't know, one different infantry unit and one different aircraft
upgrade or something.
Yeah, it's like
thankfully they have sort of progressed from that in the third and the fourth game, but it's still visible how all the races have the same base and they don't even diverge that much like in StarCraft. Right. Although there is some strategic differences, which is actually kind of cool because the core is consistent, but other things aren't. But I think that what we aim to do with like Cosmology retail is really interesting, where we even want to challenge the idea of having a same core where we will have like different workers and different town halls and etc. So
yeah, there's different, you know, construction methods, different resource harvesting will be consistent, but it's like it's almost a polar opposite of Age of Empires as a franchise or whatever, where it's like, yeah, there are things that are similar, obviously, but it's for the most part, it's like the specializations are very different. It's like it's almost like taking a macro scale view of the value of having different unit types that actually do different things, have different combat roles, have different utilities or whatever. When you have a situation like that in an RTS, you get to build up, like, here's something my army could do now that I have some number of this unit type. And when you have that situation happen, it's like, okay, well, I can do this unit. I can do these things with these units. I can use these tools in these ways. If that same thing was true about the number of races you had access to, that would also be pretty big. It's like thinking about, it's like, in this game, when I'm going up against this opponent, I can pick from, say, obviously very ambitious number of 20 regencies, which is our term for races. It's like, here's the idea of like having a crazy number of options. It's like before you even get into the game, you have so many things to pick from, at least as far as like relative to other RTS games. And they are all very distinct. They are all like as different from, you know, between like the differences between Terran and Zerg are the same differences between our regencies in that respect. And what can you do with that pitch, right? And also the idea of like really making sure that everything feels fitting. Like, I don't know how deliberate it was by Blizzard, but the example that I like to give people who are maybe unfamiliar with Brood War or never thought about it in this way is like, Zerg are supposed to be this swarming, like maybe like I would describe them as not just a force of nature that you can't reason with, but also this like super organism that is actually like, it has all of these different entities in it, but it's like they're all like sub organs or whatever, cells in a body or something like that. And what you'll see is that like if you view it through that lens, the larva with the like morphing into eggs and stuff is a little bit like that. But think about the way that mutalisks are used in professional play. And this is definitely not deliberate because Blizzard had no idea about the magic box bug. But Mutalisks in professional Brood War are used such that you basically clump a bunch of them up together and try to stack them up as much as possible, and then you attack all at once. And that is exactly the behavior you would think of like the individual parts don't matter. They're individually, the Mutalisk is very weak, especially relative to the units that you can get for the same cost. But when you have so much of them, so much so that they blend together and look like they're the same thing, that's when it becomes the most powerful thing that the Zerg have at that tier of tech. And that's where it's very reinforcing the theme, right? It's like, this is exactly what you would expect out of a superorganism. The individual parts, not so good, but put together, especially in this case, literally like breathing the same air stacked on top of each other. It's like, yeah, that's going to be significantly more powerful, and that's thematically powerful and appropriate as well. So stuff like that, if you can. Again, you don't want to make sure, like, you obviously want to make sure that it's natural to the game and it's consistent and whatever, but if you can do that with your designs, that's great, and that's what total ownership can get you, is making it so that it's not just an accident that Mutalisks turn out to be that way for Zerg, the way that I believe it was for Brood War. I don't believe it was deliberate, but the idea of deliberately aiming at that goal and trying to make sure that every race has elements of that, where their way that their gameplay is expressed actually shows off some of the traits of the race in the lore or in the characterization of them. It's like, so many people basically think of the gameplay as a completely separate entity from the story or from the lore or the characterization of the world building or whatever. And it's just another tool that you can use to tell a story. In fact, it's probably the most powerful tool for games. Is that, and that's a rabbit hole in and of itself. But it's that, like, the experiencing when an opponent really pushes you, even in a multiplayer game, you don't think of it in the terms of of lore and stuff, because they're not sending you like transmissions that are pre-scripted. They're another human being, or they're an AI or something, but there is a story being told there. It's a push and pull of two commanders struggling against each other to use whatever tools in their arsenal they can to defeat the other person. And that story is very compelling in terms of the gameplay experience, but most people don't internalize it that way. They think of it like the story is the cutscene that happens that like invalidates your actions by killing off a character you just spent an entire mission trying to protect or whatever. and the gameplay is just what we do in between the story.
Yeah, it seems like some people view games as basically grind to see a cutscene because they just want to watch a movie, but they don't know that they want to watch a movie. And it's pretty bad, because I think, personally, and I know you also believe that, is that the best story is told through gameplay and through organic interaction. Since then, it really feels natural, and it actually catches people off guard, because they are just used to a cutscene that is like just a lazy thing that doesn't, like, it's very often even apparent that cutscene actually has nothing to do with gameplay, where maybe you defeated your player with like an overwhelming amount of units, and in the cutscene you have like 4 Marines or something, and it really breaks immersion for me. I don't know how about you.
No, it's the same thing. I mean, I remember thinking about this in Halo 2. There's a scene where you blow up a Scarab or whatever, which is like the super tank that is really big. You have to literally land on top of it to kill the crew and then disassemble it or whatever. And so it's basically a set piece, and it's kind of like a movie scene or whatever afterwards when he's like walking down the hull of it as it's like blowing up. But he's holding a gun, and that gun is not always the gun that you actually had equipped. Like, if you don't have the specific gun equipped, sometimes it, like, I don't know the details of why it's like that, but basically it doesn't always show you the right gun. And even something as simple as that is like, really? Like, you couldn't even like show me holding the right weapon that I actually used in this situation, or like even like a weapon that I had equipped at the time, because obviously you can have 2 weapons in Halo. It's like neither of those weapons are what is on my screen now, and that's really wacky. Even as a kid, I remember thinking, oh, why didn't they show the right weapon there? And like I don't even know, I was 2004. I got it on launch. So I don't know. I was 10 years old, I guess, when that happened. So it's like even from that age, I knew there's something weird is going on there. I obviously didn't think too much of it deeply or whatever, but it's something that stuck with me as far as an idea is like, if you can't reflect the player experience that they had in the game by somehow reflecting that in the dialogue or in the cutscene or whatever, then maybe the cutscene and dialogue need to be revisited in some way. Like it sounds complicated, but I don't think it is. I think you can have a situation where if a player steamrolls through the enemy, the dialogue can reflect that. You can have, your adjutant saying, "Oh, you performed remarkably, Commander," or something. Or if it took you a really long time, maybe it looks at some point that you're about to lose. There can be dialogue that reflects that, where there's maybe banter between the commanders, or there's people saying like, "Oh my God, we're gonna die," because that's what it looks like. And then maybe you fight back, and you finally are able to win after like a really long, drawn out battle, and it wasn't all easy, and it didn't look like you were gonna win early. The dialogue should reflect something like that, right? You should have these sort of steps where it's like, at the very least, give me a couple options that account for the decisions that may have been made and the experience that was had. And if you can reflect that in the cutscene, then it's like, wow, these elements are really working together, and it actually does feel like there's stakes and there's consistency and there's this idea of the game and the story or whatever, the gameplay experience and the experience watching a cutscene or listening to dialogue is all consistent, right? If you can do that, then you're good. Like, that's something that I don't think you've seen too often, but I guess, like, funnily enough, like, the only kind of examples I can think of are probably like roguelikes or whatever, where I think this happened in Hades a few times, where if you like died to a certain person over and over again, they sometimes would have like a line that references that as like, "Oh, you're really struggling here," or something like you came here just to get beaten back again or something. I don't know, like stuff like that.
A bit generic, but the idea is great.
Yeah, it's actualization of the idea where it's like, yes, the dialogue in that game leaves a lot to be desired as far as like subject matter and tone, but
it surprised me very, very positively. I didn't think they would have done it. They did, even though it's like pretty basic thing to do. It doesn't come around too often. It's usually just like you usually just expect scripted things to have things like that, but the non-scripted things don't. And I think the non-scripted things are the most interesting.
Well, it's something as simple as one of the things that I plan for the missions is that there's basically there's two versions of events, right? And version one is the first time through, you watch you land and there's a dialogue event, and like you start your base up in an RTS context or whatever, and then there's a greeting, and it's like the dialogue event is like an intro into the map or whatever, and some characters are talking. Maybe you get to introduce to the opponent, or maybe you already know the opponent, but he says something to say the fact that he's here or illustrate that he's here. And then if you replay the mission, say you lose, you restart. Well, the game takes into account that you already saw the first event. So at the risk of like making you jaded and not like the original dialogue event because you're hearing it over and over again a million times, how about a slew of cut down smaller dialogue events that are just variants of it that get rotated through? And so you have, say, variant one is something where it's very short and sweet. It's just one character introducing themselves to another or whatever. It's like the essence of the dialogue event previously can be simplified and drilled down into because the previous full-length dialogue event was already experienced. So we expect the player to have known that.
And sometimes maybe you can even say something that like, "Oh, last time we had to evacuate. Let's not fuck this up this time," or something.
Yeah.
Has to suit the story you're going for, but if you can do that, that's also great, I think.
Well, I had this idea of a replayable mission that would take into account when you, like, say, it's going to be very difficult. And one of the ideas that I had for it was that if you play, like, it would be co-op. And so if you play, like, by yourself or play with, like, a certain group of people and you lose, say, I don't know, a certain number of times in a row, and then you come back with a different group of people, there would be dialogue that reflects that, where like the boss fight that you're basically doing in an RTS context, like the commander of that is like, "I see you've brought new friends to fail with," or something. There's some line like that would actually reflect the fact that, oh, first of all, somebody's played this before. Like, imagine being the new guy in the group of co-op players who jumps in and like the person they're queued up with or whatever is being bantered as having failed a lot and now is bringing in new people. Like, that's a different feeling, I think. Like, when if you're the new guy in that situation, you're like, oh shit, like this not only is the like, I don't know, I would just imagine like
I know that there were really I remember there were some, I didn't remember any of the titles, but I remember there were some games that basically used your account information from Steam to get some informations about you, and then they would actually use them in like storytelling or whatever in a dialogue where they would actually pierce the fifth wall, I think is the term. Fourth wall, yeah. Where they would directly address the human behind the computer instead of just the player, which is actually a very unique feeling when that happens, I think.
Well, in an RTS, you don't even have to worry about fourth walling because you can
Yeah.
just say that the commander that you are playing as, like your character in the game, is the one who's being addressed, right? So it can be both. But yeah, it's interesting because just imagining like again, if you think about that design exercise of imagining the better thing, it's like, how cool could cutscenes be if they were, if they reflected the experience instead of killing off a character in a cutscene that you yourself basically defeated in the gameplay. Why would you do that in a cutscene when you could have the players directly responsible for killing them, and then the cutscene is the aftermath. The cutscene is the debriefing. The cutscene is showing the result of their work, and also I think this speaks to like the fact that RTSs are large scale, but people keep wanting to like zoom in and have these cutscenes and personal drama and like love interests and stuff. It's like you could, if you're a skilled writer, I think you can work that stuff in, but it almost has to be like a representative of the scale that you're working with. So a commander has to almost be like a face to put to the name of the faction. And so if you have this RTS scale battle where there's a lot of armies smashing into each other, when you kill a character in air quotes, like you should probably also level their army, or maybe take over it or something, usurp them or something. I don't know, something like that, where it's like you did more than just eliminate a single unit, basically, in terms of real game.
Yeah, it's
you also defeated them. Yeah. Exactly. You also like you subjugated them or exterminated them or something. And it's like this is a case where they're reflecting the scale. Like when you see them, it's like a symbolic representation of that faction's collapse. And by virtue of defeating them, you've like it's basically a capstone. It's like a satisfying narrative capstone that like rounds it all up, sums it all up, and says you've won fighting against this faction. Like you're done. They are finished. It's like that. Then it makes more sense, and it's like you're reflecting the scale correctly and having that representation of the situation correct, instead of it being like, oh, we spent all of this time in a micro mission to kill. I don't even know. I can't think of any characters you do. Oh, I guess Stukov in Brood War or something. I don't know. It's like,
and
why are we even doing that? Like, yeah, it's just the whole thing is silly. So yeah, it's.
Dude, how many times did they revive a character? It's silly.
I mean, let me think. Phoenix and Stukov, but Stukov didn't get revived in Brood War. I mean, technically there was some like bonus mission where he was infested or something, but then I think there is some. I don't know.
It transformed Kerrigan 4 times, so you could technically say there was just a revives as a different person or something. That's really silly.
I like that they transformed her in Brood War, and then they transformed her back only so that she could transform again
after like 5 missions of gameplay.
Yeah. Also, then she turns into a chicken.
Oh yeah.
So
how could I forget? The epilogue was so bad. Jesus. Like the whole campaign was terrible, but the epilogue, dude, that was so shitty.
Speaking of imagining better things, would you like to close us out talking about pathfinding? Because that's what we've been working on lately as far as Antikythera goes.
Since my interest recently was dedicated to RTS games a bit, more than usual, even though that's pretty high since I work on like 2 games right now that are RTS, but one is Amon. But we have I have worked on pathfinding a bit. Previously, we used flow fields, and I've decided to experiment with A-Star to circumvent some limitations. As of right now, we still use like a tile grid, but basically, the pathfinding now is way more precise to things like unit size, and they can avoid static units and whatnot. It's a really good improvement for the quality of paths in Antikythera.
It's one of those things that obviously we're going to need to supplement at some point, especially if we end up having dynamic terrain and whatnot. But it's definitely a thing that
A-Star actually is pretty good with dynamic terrain. It works per unit instead of like per tile or whatever, and it's pretty good. But the biggest problem will be optimizing it to a point where it's actually scalable. We aim at a very high amount of units, So the more the better, obviously. So the way it will end up we'll have to wait and experiment, but basically the thing that we will be trying now is HPA star. I was also mentioned for flow fields. I have already started conceptualizing and done some work for that in Antikythera, but that's like the next step for performance. But yeah, we've had done some work, which is pretty exciting.
If anybody in the audience recognizes some of the inside jokes we have as a community, which you yourself can be a part of if you join our Discord server, I should mention that for a long time, the way that we tested the not really performance, the quality of paths generated by pathfinding was we arranged units in the shape of a U, a capital U, or I guess it could be lowercase too, but it doesn't really matter. And we called this the U trap, which is of course just why would it be anything else? But that's actually a shape that fundamentally, if you like don't have proper pathfinding calculations as far as unit to unit goes, your units will just be stuck there forever. They'll never escape the U-trap. It's over for them. And I am happy to report that with A-star pathfinding, indeed, the U-trap is not effective. It's not doesn't work anymore. We've defeated it. So
great.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Is there any wrapping thoughts you would have for this episode?
For this episode, I would like to say that obviously we're still figuring out the format. Things may change, but so far I think we did pretty well. We talked about a lot of things. I think we talked about some interesting design decisions. We talked about complexity or simplicity maybe that has interesting stuff fall out of it. Well, I think that was the case for this discussion because we really only had a couple of points written down and we were able to talk about all sorts of things. So that's cool. I guess as far as when the next episode comes out, again, like I said at the beginning, that kind of depends on how busy we are and how much stuff we have to say, but y'all can enjoy more regular content on this channel anyway, and we'll probably see you in a week or so. So, yeah, if you don't have any wrapping thoughts, I guess we can wrap up.
I just want to say, remember to take total ownership. See you later.
Yeah. Bye.